Have you ever wondered what happens when mercy collides with justice in the most unexpected way? What occurs when an ancient promise made in desperation becomes a deadly trap that threatens to tear apart an entire nation? Today, we're diving into one of the most shocking and disturbing stories in the entire Bible, a tale so twisted and filled with deception that it reads like a political thriller wrapped in divine judgment. This is the story of the Gibeonites, a people who should have been completely destroyed according to God's direct command. Yet through cunning and lies, they secured a covenant that would haunt Israel for generations. But here's where it gets absolutely chilling. Centuries later, this forgotten treaty would resurface in the most horrific way imaginable, demanding a price so brutal that it would shake the very foundations of King David's reign. I'm talking about human sacrifice. I'm talking about hanging. I'm talking about 7 innocent men paying with their lives for sins they never committed, all while their mother watched in agony for months. This isn't just ancient history. This is a window into the terrifying reality of how our choices echo through generations, how mercy without wisdom can become a curse, and how even the most righteous kings can find themselves trapped in webs of their own making. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, mercy, and the cost of keeping promises. This story has layers upon layers of deception, divine intervention, and consequences that stretch across centuries. And if you think you know how this ends, think again. Now, before we dive deep into this twisted tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might realize. We're not just looking at some obscure biblical account that happened thousands of years ago. We're examining a case study in how deception breeds deception. How mercy without discernment can lead to catastrophe. And how the sins of one generation can literally demand blood from the next. The Gibeonites weren't just any ordinary people group. They were part of the Canaanite nations that God had specifically commanded Israel to completely destroy. Not to make treaties with, not to show mercy to utterly annihilate. Yet through one of the most audacious deception schemes in biblical history, they managed to not only survive, but to secure a binding covenant with God's chosen people. But that's just the beginning. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in one of the most disturbing scenes in all of Scripture. Picture this: 7 men hanging lifeless on a hillside while their mother sits beneath them day and night, fighting off birds and wild animals, refusing to let their bodies be defiled. For months. Can you imagine that level of grief, that depth of a mother's love expressed in the most heartbreaking vigil in human history? This story forces us to grapple with questions that make us uncomfortable. When does mercy become foolishness? How do we balance compassion with obedience? What happens when our good intentions create consequences we never imagined? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does God sometimes allow the innocent to suffer for the guilty? The answers we uncover will reveal truths about human nature, divine justice, and the complex relationship between grace and judgment that will leave you stunned. Because this isn't just about ancient Israel and some forgotten tribe. This is about patterns that repeat throughout history, about the price of compromise, and about how even our best intentions can lead us down paths we never meant to walk. Let me paint the scene for you. It's approximately 1400 BC, and Joshua has just led the Israelites in a series of devastating military campaigns. Jericho has fallen in the most miraculous way imaginable, its walls collapsing at the sound of trumpets and shouts. Ai has been conquered through divine strategy after an initial defeat caused by hidden sin in the camp. Word is spreading like wildfire throughout Canaan that the God of Israel is not like the local deities. This God moves mountains, parts seas, and destroys entire armies. Terror is gripping the hearts of every Canaanite king and every tribal leader. They know what happened to Pharaoh's army. They've heard about the Amorite kings Sihon and Og, who were completely annihilated. The reputation of Israel's God has gone before them like a consuming fire, and everyone knows that resistance seems futile. But in this atmosphere of fear and desperation, one group of people made a decision that would change the course of history. The Gibeonites, along with their allied cities of Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim, came up with a plan so clever, so audacious, and so deceptive that it would fool even the wisest leaders of Israel. Here's what makes this story so fascinating. The Gibeonites didn't try to fight. They didn't attempt to form a military alliance with other Canaanite kings. Instead, they chose deception as their weapon of survival. They understood something profound about human psychology and divine law that most people miss. They knew that once a covenant was made in the name of the Lord, it became absolutely binding, even if it was obtained through lies. Think about the psychological brilliance of their scheme. They took old wineskins and cracked them. They packed stale, moldy bread. They put on worn-out sandals and patched clothing. They loaded their donkeys with supplies that looked like they had been used for months of travel. Then they appeared before Joshua and the leaders of Israel with the most convincing story you could imagine. Picture the scene. These men approach the Israelite camp looking exhausted, dusty, and travel-worn. Their clothes are tattered, their food is spoiled, their equipment is falling apart. They claim to have journeyed from a far country because they had heard of the fame of Israel's God. They say they want to make a covenant of peace because they're so impressed by the mighty works they've witnessed from afar. It's the perfect con game. They appeal to Israel's ego by praising their God. They present themselves as humble admirers who have traveled great distances just to make peace. They even bring evidence of their supposed long journey in the form of deteriorated supplies. Who would question such an elaborate setup? But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The leaders of Israel made a fatal mistake that would haunt them for generations. They trusted their eyes instead of seeking God's guidance. They looked at the evidence, heard the story, and made their decision based on human wisdom alone. The Bible specifically tells us that they did not ask counsel of the Lord. Can you see the tragedy unfolding? Here are the leaders of God's chosen people, fresh from miraculous victories that could only have come from divine intervention, and they decide to handle this situation on their own. They sample the moldy bread, examine the cracked wineskins, look at the worn-out clothes, and conclude that these people must be telling the truth. Within 3 days, the horrible reality became clear. These weren't distant foreigners who had traveled for months to make peace. These were their neighbors, people from cities just a few miles away, part of the very nations God had commanded them to destroy. The deception was complete. The covenant was binding, and the consequences would ripple through centuries of Israel's history. But what happened next reveals something profound about the character of Israel's leaders, even in their failure. When they discovered the deception, they were furious. The people grumbled against their leaders, demanding to know why they had been tricked into sparing people who should have been destroyed. There was anger, frustration, and probably fear about what God would think of their disobedience. Yet here's what's remarkable. Despite their anger, despite the pressure from the people, despite knowing they had been fooled, the leaders of Israel kept their oath. They had sworn by the Lord God of Israel, and they would not break that covenant, even though it had been obtained through lies. This decision reveals both the nobility and the tragic flaw in their character. They understood the sacredness of oaths made in God's name, but they had failed to seek God's wisdom before making the oath in the first place. The immediate solution they came up with seemed reasonable enough. The Gibeonites would live, but they would become servants. They would be woodcutters and water carriers for the tabernacle, essentially slaves whose lives would be spared in exchange for perpetual service to God's house. It appeared to be a compromise that honored both the covenant they had made and the justice that was required. For a while, This arrangement seemed to work. The Gibeonites accepted their fate as servants, probably grateful just to be alive. They became part of Israel's religious system, contributing to the maintenance of worship through their labor. Generations passed, and the whole incident might have faded into a footnote of history, if not for what happened centuries later. During the reign of King Saul, something went terribly wrong. The Bible doesn't give us all the details, but we know that Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, attempted to annihilate the Gibeonites. This wasn't just a military campaign or a border dispute. This was an attempt at genocide, a deliberate breaking of the ancient covenant that Joshua had made. Saul's motives might have seemed patriotic or even religiously motivated, but his actions violated a sacred oath that had been sworn in the name of the Lord. Saul's attack on the Gibeonites created what we might call a blood debt. In the ancient world, the shedding of innocent blood under the protection of a covenant was considered one of the most serious offenses possible. It wasn't just murder, it was covenant breaking, oath violation, and betrayal of the worst kind. Such actions were believed to bring divine judgment, not just on the perpetrator, but on the entire nation, and that's exactly what happened. Years later, during David's reign, Israel was struck by a devastating famine that lasted 3 years. Crops failed, livestock died, and the people suffered terribly. At first, David might have assumed this was just a natural disaster, or perhaps divine discipline for some unknown sin. But as the famine continued year after year, it became clear that something deeper was wrong. Finally, David did what the leaders in Joshua's time should have done at the beginning. He inquired of the Lord. He sought divine guidance to understand why this judgment had come upon the land. And the answer he received was both shocking and terrifying. The famine was divine punishment for Saul's massacre of the Gibeonites, a blood guilt that was hanging over the entire nation like a dark cloud. This is where our story takes its most disturbing turn, because the solution that emerged would test every assumption about justice, mercy, and the cost of atonement. The Gibeonites, when consulted about how this blood guilt could be removed, made a demand that would chill David to the bone. They didn't want money. They didn't want land. They didn't want political power. They wanted blood for blood. 7 of Saul's descendants, they declared, must be handed over to them to be executed as payment for the blood that Saul had shed. Only then would the covenant be satisfied, the blood guilt removed, and the land healed from its famine. David found himself caught in an impossible situation. On one hand, he had a responsibility to his people who were suffering from divine judgment because of actions he hadn't taken. On the other hand, he was being asked to hand over innocent men to die for their father's sins. These weren't criminals or rebels. They were members of the royal family whose only crime was being related to a king who had broken a sacred covenant. The decision David made and what happened next would create one of the most haunting scenes in all of biblical literature. But it would also reveal profound truths about the nature of justice, the cost of sin, and the complex relationship between divine judgment and human responsibility that echoes through every generation. What's coming next in this story will shock you, challenge your understanding of biblical justice, and force you to grapple with questions that have no easy answers. Because sometimes the most faithful thing you can do leads to consequences that break your heart, and sometimes obedience to God's law demands sacrifices that seem to contradict everything we think we know about mercy and grace. The weight of this decision must have been crushing for David. Here was a king who had spent years running from Saul, who had refused multiple opportunities to kill his predecessor, even when Saul was actively hunting him down. David had shown remarkable restraint and honor toward the house of Saul, even after becoming king. He had searched for survivors of Saul's family to show kindness to them for Jonathan's sake, and now he was being asked to do the unthinkable. But David understood something that many modern readers struggle with. He recognized that this wasn't just about personal preference or political convenience. This was about the survival of an entire nation under divine judgment. The famine wasn't going to end through prayer alone or good intentions. God had made it clear that the blood guilt required atonement, and the wronged party had the right to determine what that atonement would look like. So David made one of the most agonizing decisions recorded in Scripture. He agreed to hand over 7 of Saul's descendants to the Gibeonites. But notice the careful way he went about this. He didn't just grab random family members. He specifically protected Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, because of the covenant he had made with Jonathan. Instead, he chose 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and 5 sons of Merab, Saul's daughter. The names matter here because they represent real people with real lives, real hopes, real futures that were about to be cut short. Armoni and Mephibosheth, sons of Rizpah, and the 5 sons of Merab who had been brought up by Michal. These weren't just political pawns or abstract concepts of justice. These were young men who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last. What happened next is where this story becomes almost unbearable to read. The 7 men were handed over to the Gibeonites, who took them to Gibeah of Saul and hanged them on the mountain before the Lord. The timing is significant too. This execution took place at the beginning of barley harvest, which was springtime, the season when life should be bursting forth from the earth. But here's where the story takes a turn that will absolutely break your heart. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of these executed men, did something that defies comprehension. She took sackcloth and spread it on a rock, and she sat there beside the bodies of her dead sons and the 5 other young men. Day and night she kept vigil, fighting off the birds of prey and wild animals that would come to defile the corpses. Can you imagine the scene? A mother sitting in the blazing heat of the day and the cold darkness of night, surrounded by the bodies of 7 young men, including her own 2 sons, using nothing but her presence and determination to protect their remains from being devoured by scavengers. This went on for months from the beginning of harvest until the rains came. Think about what this meant. In that climate, bodies would decompose quickly. The smell would have been overwhelming. The psychological trauma of sitting day after day with the corpses of her children while fighting off vultures and jackals is beyond what most of us can fathom. Yet Rizpah did it out of love, out of a mother's fierce protection that doesn't end even in death. This image of Rizpah's vigil has haunted readers for thousands of years because it represents something so pure and heartbreaking about maternal love. She couldn't save her sons' lives, but she could preserve their dignity in death. She couldn't prevent the execution, but she could ensure their bodies were treated with respect. In a world where the dead were often left for animals to consume as the ultimate humiliation, Rizpah's vigil was an act of defiant love. Word of what Rizpah was doing eventually reached King David. When he heard about this mother's extraordinary devotion, something stirred in his heart. Perhaps he was moved by her love. Perhaps he was convicted about his own role in these deaths. Perhaps he realized that while justice had been served, mercy was still needed. David's response reveals the complexity of his character and the depth of his understanding about honor and dignity. He didn't just leave Rizpah to continue her heartbreaking vigil indefinitely. Instead, he took action that showed he understood the difference between necessary judgment and unnecessary cruelty. First, David arranged for the proper burial of the 7 executed men. But he didn't stop there. He also recovered the bones of Saul and Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had taken them after the Philistines had hung their bodies on the wall of Beth-shan years earlier. David brought together all these remains and buried them in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, in the land of Benjamin. This act was profoundly significant. By giving Saul and Jonathan proper burial alongside the 7 who had died for Saul's sins, David was making a statement about honor, dignity, and the complexity of justice. He was acknowledging that even though Saul had sinned grievously, he had still been God's anointed king. Even though these 7 men had to die for their father's crimes, they deserved to be buried with honor alongside their family. The result was immediate and dramatic. As soon as these burials were completed, God responded to prayer for the land, and the famine ended. The rains came, the crops grew, and the divine judgment was lifted. The blood guilt had been satisfied, the covenant violation had been atoned for, and the land was healed. But what are we supposed to make of this story? How do we process the idea that innocent people had to die for someone else's sins? How do we reconcile a God of love and mercy with a God who would allow such a brutal form of justice? These questions have troubled readers for millennia, and they should trouble us too. Some try to dismiss this story as merely reflecting the primitive morality of ancient times, suggesting that we've evolved beyond such harsh concepts of justice. But that misses the profound truths this narrative reveals about the nature of sin, justice, and consequences that transcend any particular era. First, this story demonstrates that sin has consequences that extend far beyond the original sinner. Saul's massacre of the Gibeonites didn't just affect Saul. It brought divine judgment on the entire nation and ultimately cost the lives of 7 of his descendants. This isn't arbitrary divine cruelty. This is the recognition that our actions ripple through generations in ways we often don't anticipate or understand. Consider how this plays out in our own world. The choices made by one generation affect the next. Environmental destruction, national debt, social problems, family dysfunction, all of these create consequences that future generations must deal with. The principle revealed in this story isn't outdated. It's as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. Second, this story reveals the absolute seriousness of covenant breaking. The Gibeonites had been brought under Israel's protection through a sacred oath made in the name of the Lord. When Saul violated that covenant, he wasn't just committing murder, he was breaking faith with God himself, violating the sacred nature of oaths made in the divine name. In our culture, we tend to treat promises casually. We break commitments, violate contracts, and abandon responsibilities with little thought for the long-term consequences. But this story reminds us that some promises carry weight that extends far beyond our personal convenience. When we invoke God's name, when we make sacred commitments, when we enter into covenants, we're dealing with realities that have eternal significance. Third, this story reveals the complex relationship between justice and mercy. David's situation forced him to choose between different types of mercy. He could show mercy to Saul's descendants by refusing to hand them over, but that would mean allowing the entire nation to continue suffering under divine judgment. Or he could show mercy to the nation by satisfying the demands of justice, even though it meant sacrificing innocent lives. This tension between different claims of mercy and justice isn't unique to ancient Israel. We face similar dilemmas today. Sometimes protecting one group means allowing another to suffer. Sometimes preventing greater harm requires accepting lesser harm. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do involves making choices that break our hearts. The story of Rizpah's vigil adds another layer to this complexity. Her months-long protection of the corpses shows us that even when justice must be served, dignity and love can still be preserved. Even when harsh measures are necessary, compassion and honor can still be maintained. Even when we can't prevent tragedy, we can still respond with grace. But perhaps the most important lesson from this story is about the danger of making decisions without seeking God's guidance. Remember how this whole situation began. The leaders of Israel looked at the evidence presented by the Gibeonites, trusted their own judgment, and made a covenant without asking counsel of the Lord. That single decision created consequences that lasted for centuries. How many times do we make similar mistakes? How often do we trust our own wisdom instead of seeking divine guidance? How frequently do we act based on appearances rather than seeking deeper truth? This story is a sobering reminder that some decisions carry weight far beyond what we can see in the moment. The Gibeonite deception succeeded because it appealed to human pride and played on assumptions that seemed reasonable. The Israelites wanted to believe they were so famous that distant nations would travel for months just to make peace with them. They wanted to trust the evidence of their senses, rather than take the time to seek God's will. They wanted to handle the situation efficiently, rather than carefully. These same temptations face us every day. We want to believe flattery about our abilities or achievements. We want to trust what seems obvious rather than dig deeper for truth. We want to make quick decisions based on limited information rather than take time for careful consideration and prayer. The consequences of the Israelites' hasty decision weren't immediately apparent. For years, maybe decades, the arrangement with the Gibeonites seemed to work fine. They became woodcutters and water carriers, contributing to the religious life of Israel without causing obvious problems. It was only much later, when Saul decided to break the ancient covenant, that the full weight of that original deception became clear. This delayed consequence pattern appears throughout Scripture and throughout life. The seeds we plant today may not bear fruit for years or even decades. The decisions we make in moments of pressure or pride may not reveal their full impact until long after we've forgotten about them. The compromises we accept to solve immediate problems may create far greater problems for the next generation. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of the entire story. When David finally sought the Lord about the 3-year famine, God's answer was swift and direct. The blood guilt for Saul's massacre of the Gibeonites was hanging over the land like a curse, and it would not be lifted until proper atonement was made. But here's what makes this so unsettling. God didn't offer David multiple options. He didn't suggest alternative forms of restitution. The path to healing was narrow and brutal. Think about the psychological weight this placed on David. Here was a king who had built his reputation on mercy, on sparing his enemies, on showing kindness even to those who had wronged him. David had famously refused to harm Saul even when he had the perfect opportunity. He had wept over Saul's death and honored him in his final lament. Now he was being asked to do something that went against every instinct of his compassionate nature. But David understood something that many of us struggle to grasp. Sometimes love requires us to make choices that feel like betrayal. Sometimes protecting the many means sacrificing the few. Sometimes the most faithful response to God's will involves actions that shatter our hearts and challenge our understanding of goodness. The execution itself took place on a hill in Gibeah, Saul's hometown. Can you imagine the symbolism? These 7 young men died in the very place where their father and grandfather had once ruled as king. The location where Saul had first been crowned was now the site where his bloodline paid the ultimate price for his covenant breaking. It's as if the land itself demanded that justice be served in the exact place where the original sin had been conceived. The method of execution was hanging, which in ancient times carried particular shame and horror. This wasn't a quick death by sword or even stoning. These men were suspended until they died, their bodies left exposed as a testimony to the seriousness of covenant violation. The Gibeonites chose this method deliberately, ensuring that the payment for Saul's crimes would be as public and as terrifying as possible. But let's pause here and consider something that often gets overlooked in discussions of this story. The 7 men who died weren't random victims. They were specifically chosen as representatives of Saul's house, carriers of his bloodline, inheritors of both his legacy and his guilt. In the ancient world, this concept of family responsibility wasn't unusual or considered unjust. When a king sinned, his entire dynasty could be held accountable. This raises profound questions about inherited guilt that we still wrestle with today. Are children responsible for their parents' sins? Do the consequences of one generation's failures automatically pass to the next? The biblical answer seems to be both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that our actions create conditions and consequences that affect our descendants. No, in the sense that each person is ultimately accountable before God for their own choices. The 7 descendants of Saul didn't choose to massacre the Gibeonites. They probably weren't even born when it happened. Yet they bore the consequences of their fathers' and grandfathers' covenant breaking. This wasn't divine cruelty, but rather the recognition that some sins create debts that must be paid by someone, and when the original sinner is dead, that responsibility falls to those who inherited his position and benefits. Consider how this principle operates in our modern world. When a company pollutes the environment, future generations deal with the consequences, even though they had no say in the original decisions. When governments accumulate massive debts, children who weren't even born when the spending occurred will be required to pay the bills. When families make destructive choices, the children often spend their entire lives trying to overcome the legacy of dysfunction they inherited. The story of the Gibeonites forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that we live in a world where individual actions have collective consequences, where private sins become public judgments, where the mistakes of the past create obligations for the present. This isn't unfair cosmic punishment. It's simply how moral cause and effect work in a universe where all human lives are interconnected. Now let's return to Rizpah and her heartbreaking vigil, because this is where the story reveals its deepest truths about love, sacrifice, and the dignity of the human soul. When those 7 bodies were hanging on that hillside, everyone else in Israel probably tried to forget about them as quickly as possible. The political problem had been solved. The famine was ending. Life was returning to normal. But Rizpah couldn't forget. She couldn't move on. She couldn't let her sons become just casualties in someone else's story of justice. What Rizpah did was more than just maternal grief. It was a prophetic act that spoke volumes about the value of human life and the importance of honoring even those who die as consequences of others' sins. By protecting those bodies day and night for months, she was declaring that these young men mattered. They weren't just payment for a debt. They weren't just necessary sacrifices for the greater good. They were beloved sons whose lives had value beyond their utility in satisfying divine justice. The image of Rizpah fighting off vultures and wild animals is one of the most powerful pictures of protective love in all of literature. She had no weapons except her presence. She had no shelter except the sackcloth she spread on a rock. She had no comfort except the knowledge that she was doing everything possible to preserve the dignity of her dead children. Day after day, week after week, month after month, she maintained her vigil. Think about the physical and emotional toll this must have taken. The relentless heat of the Palestinian sun during the day, the cold and danger of night hours when predators roam, the constant stench of decomposition, the psychological trauma of living surrounded by death, the social isolation of being the mother of executed criminals. Yet Rizpah endured it all because love doesn't calculate the cost when protecting what matters most. Her vigil also served as a constant reminder to everyone who passed by that the cost of Saul's sin was still being paid. Every traveler on the road, every farmer working nearby fields, every official conducting business in the region would see this woman keeping her lonely watch and remember that covenant breaking has consequences that extend far beyond the original perpetrator. Rizpah's presence made it impossible for the nation to simply move on and forget about the price that had been paid for their healing. When word of Rizpah's vigil finally reached David, it stirred something deep in his soul. Perhaps he was convicted by her example of persistent love. Perhaps he was reminded that justice without compassion becomes cruelty. Perhaps he realized that while the legal requirements of atonement had been met, the human requirements of dignity and honor were still unfulfilled. Whatever moved him, David's response revealed the heart of a true king. David's decision to gather the bones of Saul, Jonathan, and the 7 executed men for proper burial was more than just a political gesture. It was an act of restoration that acknowledged the complexity of justice and the importance of honoring even those who have fallen under judgment. By burying Saul's bones alongside those of his descendants who died for his sins, David was making a profound statement about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of dignity even in death. The burial took place in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, in the territory of Benjamin. This choice of location was deeply significant. Benjamin was Saul's tribal territory, the place where his family belonged, where their roots ran deep. By ensuring that all the remains were interred in their ancestral homeland, David was declaring that even though these men had died under divine judgment, they were still part of Israel's story, still worthy of honor and remembrance. The immediate result of this proper burial was the end of the famine. God heard prayer for the land, the rains came, and the curse was lifted. But the deeper result was the restoration of balance between justice and mercy, between the demands of divine law and the requirements of human compassion. David had found a way to satisfy both the need for atonement and the need for dignity. This resolution reveals something crucial about how God views justice. It's not enough to simply meet the legal requirements of punishment or restitution. True justice also requires that human dignity be preserved, that love be honored, that mercy find expression, even within the framework of judgment. Rizpah's vigil and David's response to it show us that God cares not just about cosmic balance, but about individual worth and family bonds. The story also demonstrates how God can work through human compassion to bring about divine purposes. Rizpah's love for her sons, David's conscience about proper burial, the people's desire to see the famine end. All of these human emotions and needs were woven together by God to create a resolution that satisfied both justice and mercy. It's a perfect example of how divine sovereignty operates through human agency rather than apart from it. But what lessons should we draw from this complex and troubling narrative? How do we apply ancient principles of blood guilt and covenant responsibility to our modern lives? The answers aren't simple, but they're profoundly important for understanding how God works in our world and how we should respond to the consequences of both our own sins and the sins of others. First, this story teaches us about the absolute importance of seeking God's guidance before making major decisions, especially those involving commitments or promises. The original Gibeonite deception succeeded because Israel's leaders trusted their own judgment rather than asking counsel of the Lord. That single failure to seek divine wisdom created consequences that lasted for centuries. How many times do we make similar mistakes in our own lives? We see what appears to be a good opportunity, a reasonable solution, or a beneficial arrangement, and we move forward based on our own analysis without taking time to pray, seek counsel, or wait for God's direction. We trust our eyes rather than our spirit, our logic rather than divine wisdom, our timeline rather than God's timing. The tragedy is that many of these hasty decisions seem to work out fine initially. The Gibeonites served faithfully as woodcutters and water carriers for generations. The arrangement appeared successful until Saul's later actions revealed the deeper problems that had been created by the original compromise. Similarly, our quick fixes and pragmatic solutions often seem effective in the short term, only to create much larger problems down the road. Second, this story reveals the interconnected nature of human responsibility and the way sin creates consequences that ripple through generations. Saul's massacre of the Gibeonites didn't just affect Saul, or even just his immediate victims. It brought divine judgment on the entire nation and ultimately cost the lives of 7 of his descendants. This isn't cosmic unfairness, but rather the recognition that we live in a world where individual actions have collective consequences. This principle operates powerfully in our contemporary world. The environmental choices made by previous generations affect the climate we inherit. The financial decisions made by governments create economic conditions that shape the opportunities available to future citizens. The family patterns established by parents influence the emotional and spiritual health of their children and grandchildren. Understanding this interconnectedness should make us more thoughtful about our choices and more compassionate toward those who are dealing with consequences they didn't directly create. It should also motivate us to consider how our current decisions might affect not just ourselves, but those who come after us. Third, this story demonstrates that sometimes love requires us to make choices that feel like betrayal, that sometimes protecting the many means sacrificing the few, that sometimes faithfulness to God's will involves actions that break our hearts. David's decision to hand over 7 innocent men was agonizing, but it was also necessary to lift the divine judgment that was destroying his entire nation. We face similar dilemmas in our own lives, though usually not as dramatic or final. Sometimes loving our children means enforcing consequences that hurt them in the short term. Sometimes being faithful to our convictions means making choices that disappoint people we care about. Sometimes doing what's right requires accepting outcomes that feel wrong to our emotions. The key is learning to distinguish between what feels loving and what actually is loving, between what seems merciful and what truly serves the greater good. This requires wisdom, prayer, and often the counsel of others who can help us see beyond our immediate emotional responses to the deeper principles at stake. Fourth, this story shows us the importance of honoring dignity even within the context of judgment. Rizpah's vigil and David's response to it demonstrate that meeting the legal requirements of justice isn't enough. True righteousness also requires that human worth be acknowledged, that love be respected, that mercy find expression even when harsh measures are necessary. This has profound implications for how we treat people who are facing consequences for their actions or the actions of others. It's not enough to simply ensure that justice is served. We also have a responsibility to preserve dignity, to show compassion, to recognize the human cost of even necessary judgments. Finally, this story reveals God's heart for restoration, even in the midst of judgment. The proper burial of Saul, Jonathan, and the 7 executed men wasn't just about ending the famine. It was about healing relationships, honoring family bonds, and demonstrating that even those who fall under divine discipline are still precious in God's sight. This gives us hope for our own failures and the failures of those we love. Yes, sin has consequences that must be faced. Yes, some choices create damage that can't be easily undone. But God's ultimate purpose is always restoration, always healing, always the redemption of what has been broken by human failure. The story of the Gibeonites is disturbing because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, mercy, and the cost of our choices. But it's also hopeful because it shows us a God who works through human love and compassion to bring about purposes that serve both divine justice and human dignity. It's a story that challenges our assumptions, breaks our hearts, and ultimately points us toward a deeper understanding of how love and justice can coexist in a broken world. What makes this story even more haunting is how it exposes the dangerous game of spiritual compromise that continues to play out in every generation. Because here's what most people miss when they read about the Gibeonites. This wasn't just ancient history. This was a preview of how deception, once welcomed into our lives, creates a debt that someone, somewhere, somehow will eventually have to pay. Think about it. The moment Joshua and the elders made that covenant without seeking God's guidance, they didn't just spare a few Canaanite cities. They introduced a foreign element into the very heart of Israel's spiritual DNA. These people who should have been completely removed from the land became permanent residents, workers in the house of God, witnesses to every sacred ceremony, observers of every holy ritual. For generations, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The Gibeonites appeared to serve faithfully. They cut wood and carried water. They contributed to the religious life of Israel without causing obvious problems. But underneath the surface, something far more sinister was taking root. A precedent had been established. A pattern had been set. The idea that God's clear commands could be circumvented through human cleverness and good intentions had been planted in Israel's collective consciousness. This is exactly how spiritual compromise works in our own lives. We make one decision that seems reasonable, practical, even merciful. We choose convenience over obedience, efficiency over seeking God's will, human wisdom over divine guidance. And initially, everything appears fine. The compromise seems to work. Life goes on. We convince ourselves that we made the right choice. But compromise is like a slow-acting poison. It doesn't kill immediately. Instead, it weakens the spiritual immune system, making us more susceptible to future deceptions, more willing to rationalize the next shortcut, more confident in our ability to manage situations that should be surrendered to God's control. The Gibeonites lived among Israel for centuries before the full cost of that original deception became clear. During all those years, they were observing, learning, adapting, becoming part of the landscape. They knew Israel's strengths and weaknesses, their military strategies and spiritual practices, their leaders and their vulnerabilities. When crisis came, they knew exactly how to leverage their position to demand the ultimate price. This is the terrifying reality of spiritual compromise. The things we allow into our lives, because they seem harmless, manageable, or even beneficial, can become the very instruments that destroy us later. The relationships we maintain despite knowing they pull us away from God. The habits we justify because they're not obviously sinful. The attitudes we tolerate because confronting them would be uncomfortable. All of these seemingly small compromises create footholds for destruction that may not manifest for years or even decades. But let's dig deeper into what happened during those centuries between Joshua's covenant and David's crisis, because this is where the story becomes truly chilling. The Bible doesn't give us a detailed account, but we can piece together enough to understand that something fundamental shifted in how Israel viewed their relationship with the Canaanite peoples who remained in the land. Remember, God's original command was crystal clear. Every Canaanite nation was to be completely destroyed, not enslaved, not converted, not integrated, utterly annihilated. This wasn't arbitrary divine cruelty. This was surgical removal of spiritual cancer that would otherwise metastasize throughout Israel's entire system. God knew something that Israel's leaders didn't fully grasp. He understood that these nations carried within their cultures, religions, and worldviews elements that were fundamentally incompatible with the covenant relationship he was establishing with his chosen people. Their gods demanded child sacrifice. Their worship practices included sacred prostitution. Their moral systems normalized behaviors that would corrupt Israel's understanding of holiness, justice, and human dignity. The Gibeonite deception succeeded precisely because it played on Israel's desire to be seen as reasonable, merciful, and sophisticated. Look how far we've traveled, the Gibeonites essentially argued. Look how impressed we are with your God. Look how willing we are to serve and submit. Surely you're too civilized, too enlightened, too godly to simply destroy people who come seeking peace. It was the perfect manipulation because it appealed to Israel's pride while simultaneously undermining their obedience. It made disobedience to God's clear command seem like the more spiritual choice. It reframed mercy as rebellion and presented compromise as wisdom, and for centuries, this seemed to work. The Gibeonites served in the tabernacle and later the temple. They became part of Israel's religious infrastructure. They were present for every major ceremony, every sacred festival, every moment when God's presence manifested among his people. They witnessed miracles, heard prophecies, observed the power of the true God in ways that should have transformed them completely. But here's what's so disturbing about this arrangement. Despite being eyewitnesses to the reality of Israel's God for generations, despite serving in his house and participating in his worship, the Gibeonites never truly became part of God's people. They remained fundamentally foreign, spiritually separate, culturally distinct. They served, but they didn't surrender. They participated, but they didn't transform. This reveals something profound about the difference between religious activity and genuine conversion. You can be involved in spiritual practices without being spiritually alive. You can serve in God's house without having God's heart. You can witness miracles without experiencing personal transformation. The Gibeonites prove that proximity to holiness doesn't automatically produce holiness, that exposure to truth doesn't necessarily result in transformation. When the moment came for them to demand justice for Saul's massacre, they didn't ask for anything that would demonstrate spiritual growth or kingdom values. They didn't request that Israel's God be honored or that his law be established more firmly in the land. They didn't seek reconciliation or restoration or any of the things that characterize people who have been genuinely touched by divine grace. Instead, they demanded blood, 7 lives, public execution, the most brutal form of justice available under ancient law. Their request revealed that despite centuries of exposure to Israel's God, they still thought in terms of revenge rather than redemption, retribution rather than restoration, eye for eye justice rather than the higher principles of mercy and forgiveness that God was trying to teach his people. This exposes the ultimate tragedy of spiritual compromise. When we allow unregenerate influences to remain in positions of influence within our spiritual communities, we don't gradually convert them to our values. Instead, they gradually convert us to theirs. The Gibeonites didn't become more like Israelites over the centuries. If anything, their demand for blood revenge suggests they influenced Israel to become more like ancient Canaanites. Think about how this pattern plays out in contemporary church life. We invite people into leadership positions based on their skills, charisma, or social connections, rather than their spiritual maturity. We assume that exposure to Christian community will naturally transform them, that involvement in church activities will automatically produce character growth. But what often happens instead is that their unregenerate values begin to shape the community rather than being shaped by it. The successful businessman who brings corporate ruthlessness into church decision-making. The charming individual who uses their position to manipulate others for personal gain. The talented person who leverages their gifts to build their own kingdom rather than God's. These people may serve faithfully for years or even decades, but when crisis comes, their true nature is revealed, and the community discovers that they've been harboring influences that were never truly submitted to God's authority. This is exactly what happened with the Gibeonites. When they finally had the opportunity to demonstrate what centuries of exposure to Israel's God had produced in their hearts, they revealed that they were still operating from a fundamentally pagan worldview. They wanted justice, but not God's justice. They wanted satisfaction, but not the kind of satisfaction that leads to healing and restoration. Their demand for 7 lives wasn't just about evening the score for Saul's massacre. It was about establishing their power, demonstrating their ability to extract the ultimate price from Israel's royal family, proving that even God's chosen people would have to bow to their requirements when they held the moral high ground. And here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. David, who had spent his entire life trying to honor God's will and protect innocent life, found himself forced to comply with a demand that violated everything he believed about mercy and justice. The man who had refused to kill Saul, even when he had multiple opportunities, who had shown kindness to Saul's family, who had built his reputation on sparing his enemies, was now required to hand over 7 innocent men to be executed. The psychological torment this must have caused David is almost unimaginable. Every instinct of his compassionate nature would have rebelled against this decision. Every principle he had lived by would have screamed in protest. Yet he also understood that his personal feelings were less important than the survival of his entire nation under divine judgment. This is where the story forces us to confront one of the most difficult aspects of spiritual maturity. Sometimes doing what's right requires accepting outcomes that feel completely wrong. Sometimes faithfulness to God's will demands choices that seem to contradict everything we think we know about His character. Sometimes love requires us to make decisions that break our hearts. David's situation illustrates the agonizing complexity of leadership in a fallen world. Leaders often face choices where every option involves some form of tragedy, where protecting one group means allowing another to suffer, where preventing greater harm requires accepting lesser harm. The burden of these decisions can be crushing, especially for people who genuinely care about human welfare and divine approval. But notice what David didn't do. He didn't try to find a loophole or negotiate alternative terms. He didn't attempt to satisfy the Gibeonites with money or land or political concessions. He didn't delay the decision, hoping that circumstances would change or that God would provide a different solution. Once he understood what was required, he moved forward with the terrible courage that true leadership sometimes demands. This reveals something crucial about how we should respond when God's will conflicts with our emotional preferences. Spiritual maturity isn't about never feeling torn between competing values. It's about choosing obedience even when obedience hurts, about trusting God's wisdom even when we can't understand His ways, about accepting His timing even when we desperately wish things could be different. The 7 men who were chosen for execution represent one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this entire story. They weren't the ones who had massacred the Gibeonites. They probably weren't even born when Saul made that decision. Their only crime was being related to a king who had broken a sacred covenant. Yet they bore the ultimate consequence for sins they had never committed. This raises profound questions about inherited guilt and family responsibility that echo through every generation. In what sense are children accountable for their parents' failures? How do the sins of one generation create obligations for the next? When does individual responsibility begin and collective responsibility end? The biblical answer seems to be that while each person is ultimately accountable to God for their own choices, we live in a world where individual actions create collective consequences. The environmental damage caused by previous generations affects the air we breathe and the water we drink. The financial decisions made by governments shape the economic opportunities available to future citizens. The family patterns established by parents influence the emotional and spiritual health of their children. This interconnectedness isn't unfair cosmic punishment. It's simply how moral cause and effect operate in a universe where human lives are deeply intertwined. When we make choices, we're not just affecting ourselves, we're creating conditions that will shape the experiences of those who come after us. The 7 descendants of Saul who died on that hillside in Gibeah were paying a price they didn't choose to incur, but they were also beneficiaries of a royal heritage they didn't earn. They had enjoyed the privileges of being part of Saul's family line, living in his palaces, bearing his name, inheriting his wealth and status. When the time came to pay the cost of that heritage, they couldn't claim only the benefits while rejecting the responsibilities. This principle operates powerfully in our contemporary world. Those of us who have inherited the blessings of previous generations' faithfulness also inherit the obligations created by their failures. We benefit from the freedoms won by those who sacrifice before us, but we also bear responsibility for addressing the injustices they failed to correct. We enjoy the prosperity created by earlier economic decisions, but we also inherit the debts and environmental costs those decisions produced. Understanding this inheritance of both blessing and burden should make us more thoughtful about our own choices and more compassionate toward those who are struggling with consequences they didn't directly create. It should also motivate us to consider how our current decisions will affect not just ourselves, but the generations that follow us. The execution itself took place at the beginning of barley harvest, which was springtime, the season when life typically bursts forth from the earth. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was precisely because this was the season of new life that the sacrifice carried maximum symbolic weight. Death in the midst of life, judgment in the season of hope, an ending that would make possible a new beginning. The 7 men were hanged on a hill in Gibeah, Saul's hometown, the very place where he had first been crowned as Israel's king. The location carried profound symbolic significance. The site that had once witnessed the birth of Saul's dynasty now became the place where his bloodline paid the ultimate price for his covenant violation. It was as if the land itself demanded that justice be served in the exact location where the original sin had been conceived and nurtured. The method of execution was hanging, which in the ancient world carried particular shame and horror. This wasn't a quick death by sword or even the communal participation of stoning. These men were suspended until they died, their bodies left exposed as a public testimony to the seriousness of covenant breaking. The Gibeonites chose this method deliberately, ensuring that the payment for Saul's crimes would be as visible and as terrifying as possible. But the most haunting aspect of the entire execution was what happened next. As those 7 bodies hung lifeless on that hillside, most of Israel probably tried to forget about them as quickly as possible. The political crisis had been resolved, the famine was ending, divine judgment was being lifted, life was returning to normal, and normal people wanted to move on from the unpleasant necessity of what had just occurred. Everyone, that is, except Rizpah. This woman, who had lost 2 of her sons in the execution, did something that defied every expectation of how a grieving mother should behave. Instead of retreating into private mourning or accepting the finality of what had happened, she took sackcloth and spread it on a rock near the execution site. Then she sat down beside the bodies of her dead sons and the 5 other young men, and she began a vigil that would last for months. Day and night, through blazing heat and cold darkness, through rain and wind and the relentless march of time, Rizpah maintained her watch. She fought off vultures that came to devour the corpses. She drove away wild animals that sought to drag the bodies into the wilderness. She became a living shield between the dead and those who would defile them, using nothing but her presence and her fierce maternal love as weapons against the forces of decay and dishonor. Can you imagine the physical and emotional toll this vigil exacted? The constant exposure to the elements, the overwhelming stench of decomposition, the psychological trauma of living surrounded by death day after day, week after week, the social isolation of being identified as the mother of executed criminals, the exhaustion of maintaining constant vigilance against scavengers while dealing with her own overwhelming grief. Yet Rizpah endured it all because love doesn't calculate the cost when protecting what matters most. Her vigil wasn't just about preserving the physical remains of her sons. It was about declaring their worth, honoring their dignity, refusing to let them become merely footnotes in someone else's story of justice. In a world that had moved on from their deaths, she insisted that their lives still mattered. Her presence on that hillside also served as a constant reminder to everyone who passed by that the cost of Saul's sin was still being paid. Every traveler on the road, every farmer working nearby fields, Every official conducting business in the region would see this woman keeping her lonely watch and be forced to remember that covenant breaking has consequences that extend far beyond the original perpetrator. Rizpah's vigil made it impossible for the nation to simply forget about the price that had been paid for their healing. Her grief became a living monument to the reality that justice, even necessary justice, always comes at a human cost. Her love became a testimony to the truth that behind every political solution, every divine judgment, every necessary sacrifice, there are real people with real relationships who bear the weight of consequences they didn't choose. When word of what Rizpah was doing finally reached King David, something stirred deep in his soul. Perhaps he was convicted by her example of persistent love. Perhaps he was reminded that justice without compassion becomes cruelty. Perhaps he realized that while the legal requirements of atonement had been met, the human requirements of dignity and honor were still unfulfilled. Whatever moved him, David's response revealed the heart of a true king, and the character of someone who understood that leadership involves more than just managing crises and making hard decisions. True leadership also requires recognizing when mercy can be shown without compromising justice, when dignity can be restored without undermining necessary discipline, when human worth can be honored even within the framework of divine judgment. David's decision to gather the bones of Saul, Jonathan, and the 7 executed men for proper burial was more than just a political gesture or an act of royal clemency. It was a profound statement about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of dignity even in death. By ensuring that all these remains were interred together in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father David was declaring that even though these men had died under divine judgment, they were still part of Israel's story, still worthy of honor and remembrance. The choice of burial location was deeply significant. The tomb of Kish was in the territory of Benjamin, Saul's tribal homeland, the place where his family's roots ran deepest. By bringing all the remains to this ancestral resting place, David was acknowledging that death doesn't erase family bonds, that judgment doesn't nullify love, that even those who fall under divine discipline retain their connection to the community of God's people. This act of restoration revealed David's understanding of the complex relationship between justice and mercy. He hadn't been able to prevent the execution of the 7 men because divine justice required their deaths, but he could ensure that their deaths weren't the final word in their story. He could demonstrate that punishment doesn't preclude honor, that consequences don't eliminate compassion, that even necessary judgments can be tempered with grace. The immediate result of this proper burial was dramatic and unmistakable. As soon as the remains were laid to rest in Kish's tomb, God heard prayer for the land, the rains came, and the 3-year famine ended. The divine judgment that had hung over Israel like a dark cloud was finally lifted, and the land began to heal from the consequences of Saul's covenant breaking. But the deeper result was the restoration of balance between justice and mercy, between the demands of divine law and the requirements of human compassion. David had found a way to satisfy both the need for atonement and the need for dignity, both the requirements of cosmic justice and the longings of individual hearts. This resolution demonstrates something crucial about how God views justice. It's not enough to simply meet the legal requirements of punishment or restitution. True justice also requires that human dignity be preserved, that love be honored, that mercy find expression even within the framework of judgment. The story shows us that God cares not just about cosmic balance, but about individual worth and family relationships. The narrative also reveals how God can work through human compassion to bring about divine purposes. Rizpah's love for her sons, David's conscience about proper burial, the people's desire to see the famine end, the Gibeonites' demand for justice. All of these human emotions and needs were woven together by divine sovereignty to create a resolution that honored both law and grace. It's a perfect example of how God's will operates through human agency rather than apart from it. He doesn't override our personalities, emotions, or relationships to accomplish his purposes. Instead, he works within and through them, using our loves and loyalties and even our failures to bring about outcomes that serve his kingdom while honoring our humanity. But as we near the end of this shocking tale, we're left with questions that reach far beyond ancient Israel and challenge every assumption we have about justice, mercy, and the cost of keeping promises. What does it mean that innocent people sometimes suffer for others' sins? How do we balance compassion with obedience when they seem to conflict? Why does God sometimes allow the most heartbreaking solutions to be the right ones? The answers we've uncovered reveal truths about human nature, divine justice, and the complex relationship between grace and judgment that should leave us both humbled and hopeful. Because this story isn't just about what happened 3,000 years ago in a land far away. It's about patterns that repeat in every generation, principles that operate in every culture, and choices that we face whenever we're tempted to trust our own wisdom rather than seek God's will. The legacy of the Gibeonites reminds us that some decisions create consequences that last far longer than we ever imagined, that some compromises extract prices we never intended to pay, and that some promises bind us in ways we never fully understood when we made them. But it also shows us that even in the darkest moments of judgment and loss, love finds a way to express itself. Mercy discovers opportunities to manifest, and hope emerges from the ashes of what seemed like complete tragedy. The story of Rizpah's vigil has echoed through history as one of the most powerful testimonies to the strength of maternal love. But there's something even more profound happening beneath the surface of this heartbreaking scene. Because when we look closely at what she was doing during those long months on that desolate hillside, we discover that her actions were speaking a language that transcended grief, declaring truths about human worth and divine justice that would reshape how an entire nation understood the relationship between mercy and judgment. Think about the symbolic weight of what was unfolding. Here was a woman who had lost everything that mattered most to her, yet she refused to let that loss become meaningless. She couldn't bring her sons back to life, but she could ensure that their deaths retained dignity. She couldn't prevent the execution, but she could control how their memory would be preserved. In a world that had moved on from their tragedy, she became the keeper of their story. But Rizpah's vigil was more than just personal grief made visible. It was a prophetic act that challenged the entire framework within which Israel understood justice and atonement. By maintaining her watch day and night, month after month, she was essentially asking a question that no one else dared to voice. Yes, divine justice has been satisfied. Yes, the blood guilt has been paid. Yes, the famine is ending. But what about the human cost? What about the mothers who weep? What about the lives that were cut short not for their own sins, but for the failures of others? Her presence on that hillside forced everyone who encountered her to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that justice, even necessary justice, always comes at a price that extends far beyond legal requirements. Every person who passed by and saw this woman keeping her lonely vigil was confronted with the truth that behind every divine judgment, every political solution, every necessary sacrifice, there are real relationships, real losses, real people bearing consequences they never chose. This confrontation with the human dimension of divine justice wasn't comfortable for anyone. It would have been much easier for Israel to celebrate the end of the famine and forget about the 7 men whose deaths had made that healing possible. It would have been more convenient to focus on the restoration of divine favor and ignore the ongoing grief of those who had paid the ultimate price for that restoration. But Rizpah wouldn't let them forget. Her vigil became a living reminder that justice without compassion is incomplete, that healing without acknowledgement of cost is hollow, that moving forward without honoring those left behind is a form of spiritual amnesia that impoverishes the soul of a nation. The physical demands of what she was doing were almost beyond human endurance. The Palestinian climate is brutal, with scorching heat during the day and cold that cuts to the bone at night. The spring and summer months when she maintained her vigil would have brought sandstorms, occasional rain, and the relentless sun that beats down without mercy on exposed hillsides. But the emotional and psychological toll was even more devastating. Imagine the sensory assault of living surrounded by decomposing bodies for months. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, a constant reminder of death that would have penetrated her clothing, her hair, her very skin. The visual trauma of watching the bodies of her beloved sons slowly decay while she was powerless to prevent it would have been enough to break most people's sanity. Yet she endured it all because love doesn't calculate the cost when something precious is at stake. Her vigil wasn't driven by logic or even by hope that her actions would change anything. It was driven by the fierce protective instinct of a mother who refused to let her children be forgotten, dishonored, or reduced to mere statistics in someone else's story of justice. The wild animals and birds of prey that she fought off night after night represented more than just physical threats to the corpses. In the ancient world, being devoured by scavengers was considered the ultimate humiliation, a fate worse than death itself. Bodies that were consumed by vultures and jackals were believed to be cut off from any possibility of honor in death, their memory polluted by the manner of their destruction. By preventing this desecration, Rizpah was preserving more than just physical remains. She was protecting the dignity of her son's memory, ensuring that their story would be one of sacrifice rather than shame, of love rather than abandonment, of honor rather than dishonor. Every vulture she drove away, every wild dog she frightened off, was a victory for the principle that human worth transcends even death. The social isolation she endured during those months was perhaps equally devastating. In ancient cultures, touching or even being near corpses rendered a person ceremonially unclean, cutting them off from normal social interaction and religious participation. Rizpah's vigil would have made her an outcast, someone to be avoided and pitied, a living reminder of tragedy that most people would have preferred to forget. Yet she chose this isolation willingly because preserving her son's dignity mattered more to her than maintaining her own social standing. She accepted the role of outcast because being present with her dead children was more important than being accepted by the living community. Her love was stronger than her need for approval, her commitment deeper than her desire for comfort. The months passed slowly, marked by the gradual changes in the body she protected and the slow cycle of seasons that brought different challenges to her vigil. Spring gave way to summer, summer moved toward fall, and still she maintained her watch. The initial shock of the execution faded from public memory. Political attention moved on to other crises, and life in Israel returned to its normal rhythms. But Rizpah remained. Through the blazing heat of summer days, when the sun seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. Through the long darkness of night hours, when every sound could signal the approach of predators. Through rainstorms that turned the hillside into mud, and windstorms that filled the air with stinging sand. Through the crushing loneliness of being the only person in the world who still cared enough to stay. Her endurance during this impossible vigil reveals something profound about the nature of love itself. True love doesn't diminish with time or fade when circumstances become unbearable. It doesn't calculate the cost or measure the benefit or evaluate whether the effort is worth the outcome. It simply persists, like a flame that continues burning even when there's no visible fuel to sustain it. The image of Rizpah sitting alone on that rock, surrounded by death yet radiating life through her fierce protective presence, has inspired countless works of art, literature, and music throughout history. Artists have seen in her story a perfect illustration of love's triumph over despair, of hope's persistence in the face of impossible circumstances, of human dignity asserting itself even in the most degrading situations. But perhaps most importantly, her vigil served as a form of intercession that went far beyond personal grief. By maintaining her watch over those 7 bodies, she was essentially standing in the gap between divine justice and human mercy, between cosmic law and individual worth, between the requirements of atonement and the needs of the heart. Her presence on that hillside was a prayer without words, a petition for compassion that spoke more eloquently than any verbal plea could have done. She was asking God and her nation to remember that behind every act of justice, there are people who love and grieve and hope for mercy even when they don't expect it. When word of Rizpah's extraordinary vigil finally reached King David, it stirred something deep in his soul that went far beyond political calculation or royal duty. Here was a king who had built his reputation on mercy, who had repeatedly shown kindness to his enemies, who had refused multiple opportunities to take vengeance, even when it would have been justified. Yet he had been forced by circumstances to make a decision that violated every instinct of his compassionate nature. The news of what this mother was doing must have hit him like a physical blow. Here was a woman demonstrating the kind of persistent love that he himself had always tried to embody. Yet her vigil was a direct result of his own decision to hand over her sons for execution. Her faithfulness highlighted his own inner conflict. Her love magnified his own guilt. Her sacrifice reminded him of the human cost of the choice he had been forced to make. But David's response to learning about Rizpah's vigil reveals the depth of his character and the authenticity of his heart for both justice and mercy. He didn't ignore the news or dismiss it as irrelevant to affairs of state. He didn't rationalize his original decision or defend the necessity of what had been done. Instead, he recognized in her actions a call to something higher, a reminder that even when justice has been satisfied, mercy can still find expression. David understood that Rizpah's vigil was more than just personal grief. It was a prophetic act that revealed what was still missing from the resolution of this crisis. Yes, the legal requirements of blood guilt had been met. Yes, divine judgment had been satisfied. Yes, the famine had ended and the land was healing, but the human dimension of the tragedy had been left unaddressed. The proper burial that David arranged wasn't just about ending Rizpah's vigil or solving a public relations problem. It was about acknowledging that even when harsh measures are necessary, dignity must be preserved. Even when judgment must be executed, love must be honored. Even when divine law requires sacrifice, human worth must be recognized and respected. David's decision to gather not just the bones of the 7 executed men, but also the long-neglected remains of Saul and Jonathan, reveals his understanding that healing requires more than just satisfying immediate demands. True restoration involves addressing old wounds, honoring forgotten sacrifices, and ensuring that even those who have fallen under judgment are remembered with dignity. The fact that he chose to bury all these remains together in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, was profoundly significant. By placing the bones of the 7 men who died for Saul's sins alongside the bones of Saul himself, David was making a statement about family, forgiveness, and the possibility of honor even in death. He was declaring that judgment doesn't erase relationship, that consequences don't eliminate love, that even necessary punishment can be tempered with grace. This act of restoration immediately resulted in divine approval. God heard prayer for the land, the rains came, and the cycle of judgment was finally complete. But the deeper significance lay in what David had learned about the relationship between justice and mercy, between divine law and human compassion, between necessary decisions and ongoing responsibility for those affected by those decisions. The story forces us to grapple with questions that extend far beyond ancient Israel into the deepest challenges of moral reasoning and spiritual maturity. When does mercy become foolishness? How do we balance compassion with obedience when they seem to conflict? What do we do when the right choice still feels wrong to our hearts? The answers aren't simple, but they're essential for anyone who who wants to understand how God works in a broken world where perfect solutions are rarely available. Sometimes love requires us to make choices that break our hearts. Sometimes faithfulness demands actions that seem to contradict our understanding of grace. Sometimes the most merciful thing we can do in the long term requires accepting tragic consequences in the short term. But the story also reveals that God's heart is always inclined toward restoration, even within the framework of judgment. The proper burial of those 7 men wasn't required by law or demanded by justice. It was an act of pure grace, a demonstration that even when harsh measures are necessary, dignity can still be preserved, love can still be honored, and mercy can still find expression. This gives us hope for our own failures and the failures of those we love. Yes, sin has consequences that must be faced. Yes, some choices create damage that can't be easily undone. Yes, sometimes innocent people suffer for others' mistakes. But God's ultimate purpose is always redemption, always healing, always the restoration of what has been broken by human failure. The legacy of this story continues to challenge and inspire people thousands of years after it was first recorded. It reminds us that our choices have consequences that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances, that the promises we make create obligations that may outlast our own lives, that the compromises we accept to solve immediate problems may create far greater problems for future generations. But it also shows us that even in the darkest moments of judgment and loss, love finds a way to express itself, mercy discovers opportunities to manifest, and hope emerges from situations that seem hopeless. Rizpah's vigil stands as an eternal testimony to the power of love to transform even the most tragic circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. The image of a mother sitting beside the bodies of her dead sons, fighting off scavengers day and night for months, should disturb us. It should make us uncomfortable with easy answers about justice and mercy. It should force us to grapple with the reality that in a fallen world, even necessary judgments come at a human cost that extends far beyond legal requirements. But it should also inspire us with the knowledge that love like Rizpah's exists, that such dedication is possible, that human beings are capable of transcending their own comfort and safety to protect what matters most to them. Her story reminds us that even when we can't change outcomes, we can still choose how we respond to them. Even when we can't prevent tragedy, we can still determine whether that tragedy will be meaningless or meaningful, whether it will be forgotten or remembered, whether it will divide us or unite us in recognition of our common humanity. The Gibeonites got their justice. The blood guilt was satisfied. The divine judgment was lifted. But it was Rizpah's love that transformed a brutal execution into a story of hope, a mother's vigil that turned necessary judgment into lasting testimony about the dignity of human life and the power of persistent love. As we reflect on this ancient story, we're forced to confront our own assumptions about fairness, justice, and the cost of our choices. We're challenged to consider how our decisions might affect not just ourselves, but those who come after us. We're invited to examine whether we're willing to seek God's guidance, even when it might lead us down paths we'd rather not walk. But most importantly, we're reminded that in a world where perfect solutions are rare and tragic choices are sometimes necessary, love still matters, dignity still counts, and mercy can still find expression even within the framework of divine judgment. The story of the Gibeonites is ultimately not about the failure of justice or the absence of mercy. It's about the complex, sometimes painful process through which both justice and mercy work together to heal what has been broken and restore what has been lost. And in that process, even the most shocking rituals, the most disturbing judgments, and the most heartbreaking sacrifices can become part of a larger story of redemption that extends far beyond our ability to understand or control. Or, because the God who demanded justice for the Gibeonites is also the God who honored Rizpah's vigil and moved David's heart toward mercy. He is the God who works through both law and grace, both judgment and compassion, both consequences and forgiveness, to accomplish purposes that serve both his holiness and his love. The shocking ritual of the Gibeonites teaches us that in God's economy, nothing is wasted, no love is forgotten, and no sacrifice is meaningless. Even the darkest chapters of judgment can become the foundation for the brightest expressions of mercy. Even the most tragic consequences can become the seedbed for the most beautiful demonstrations of grace. This brings us to perhaps the most profound and unsettling aspect of the entire Gibeonite saga, because what we've witnessed isn't just an isolated incident of ancient justice gone wrong. It's a perfect case study in how spiritual compromise creates generational cycles that repeat with terrifying precision, how the seeds of deception planted in one era inevitably produce harvests of judgment in another, and how the very mercy we think we're showing can become the instrument of our greatest destruction. Let me show you something that will absolutely chill you to the bone. The Gibeonite deception didn't just create immediate problems for Joshua's generation. It established a pattern, a spiritual DNA, that would infect Israel's decision-making process for centuries to come. Because once you've successfully circumvented God's clear command through human cleverness, once you've proven that good intentions can override divine instructions, once you've demonstrated that mercy without wisdom can masquerade as righteousness, you've opened a door that can never be fully closed. Think about what happened in the generations that followed. Every time Israel faced a similar situation, every time they encountered people who should have been removed but presented compelling reasons to be spared, the precedent of the Gibeonites was there whispering in their collective memory. Look how well it worked out before. Look how reasonable it seemed. Look how the servants of God blessed the arrangement. This is exactly how spiritual compromise metastasizes through communities, families, and nations. One decision that seems wise in the moment creates a framework for future decisions that seem equally wise but are actually progressively more destructive. Each compromise makes the next one easier to justify. Each shortcut makes the next one appear more reasonable. Each time we choose human wisdom over divine guidance, we strengthen the neural pathways that make that choice feel natural and right. The most terrifying part is how long this process can take to reveal its true nature. The Gibeonites served faithfully for generations. They became part of Israel's religious infrastructure. They were present for every major ceremony, every sacred festival, every moment when God's presence manifested among his people. To most observers, they appeared to be model citizens, proof that mercy and integration could work, evidence that God's harsh commands about complete destruction were perhaps too extreme for civilized people. But underneath the surface, something far more sinister was developing. These people who had gained their position through deception, who had secured their survival through manipulation, who had established their place in Israel through lies, were learning. They were observing. They were understanding exactly how Israel's system worked, where the pressure points were, what leverage could be applied when the moment was right. And when that moment finally came, when Saul's massacre gave them the moral high ground they needed, they didn't hesitate to use everything they had learned about Israel's character, values, and decision-making processes to extract the ultimate price. They understood that Israel's commitment to covenant keeping could be weaponized against them. They knew that the same honor that had originally spared their lives could be manipulated to destroy their enemies. This is the ultimate irony of the entire story. The very mercy that Israel showed to the Gibeonites became the instrument through which the Gibeonites extracted blood from Israel's royal family. The covenant that was supposed to protect became the weapon that was used to kill. The grace that seemed so enlightened and sophisticated became the trap that destroyed 7 innocent lives. Can you see the pattern? This is exactly how spiritual compromise works in our own lives and communities. The relationships we maintain despite knowing they pull us away from God eventually become the very channels through which destruction enters our lives. The habits we justify because they're not obviously sinful gradually erode our spiritual defenses until we're vulnerable to attacks we never saw coming. The attitudes we tolerate because confronting them would be uncomfortable slowly poison our judgment until we can no longer distinguish between wisdom and foolishness. The Gibeonites spent centuries studying Israel, learning their weaknesses, understanding their psychology, preparing for the moment when they could turn Israel's own values against them. And when that moment came, they were ready with a demand so perfectly calculated, so precisely targeted, so brilliantly manipulative, that even a king like David, who had built his entire reputation on mercy and wisdom, had no choice but to comply. Think about the psychological warfare involved in their demand. They didn't just ask for justice. They asked for the most brutal, public, shameful form of justice available under ancient law. They didn't just want Saul's family to pay a price. They wanted that price to be as visible, as humiliating, as psychologically devastating as possible. They wanted every person in Israel to see those 7 bodies hanging on that hillside and understand that even God's chosen people, even the royal family, even the descendants of the anointed king were subject to their power when they held the moral advantage. This wasn't just about evening the score for Saul's massacre. This was about establishing dominance, demonstrating control, proving that they could make Israel dance to their tune whenever they possessed the leverage to do so. It was the ultimate reversal of the original relationship, where they had come as supplicants begging for mercy, and Israel had held all the power. Now, they were the ones making demands, setting terms, determining the price that had to be paid. Now, Israel was the one in the position of weakness, forced to comply with requirements that violated every instinct of their compassionate nature. The servants had become the masters. The protected had become the protectors. The recipients of mercy had become the dispensers of judgment. And David, caught in this impossible situation, discovered what so many leaders throughout history have learned to their horror. Sometimes the most faithful response to God's will requires making choices that feel like betrayal. Sometimes protecting the many means sacrificing the few. Sometimes the price of past mistakes can only be paid in present blood. The selection of the 7 men who would die reveals another layer of the psychological torment involved in this entire situation. David couldn't just randomly choose victims from Saul's family. He had to carefully consider relationships, obligations, and promises that created competing claims on his loyalty and protection. He had made a covenant with Jonathan to show kindness to his descendants, which protected Mephibosheth from selection, but that protection only made the choice of the other 7 more agonizing, because it meant deliberately selecting some family members for death while sparing others based on criteria that had nothing to do with their personal guilt or innocence. Imagine being one of those 7 men, waking up to discover that your life had been traded away to satisfy a debt you had no part in creating. Imagine learning that your death had been determined not by anything you had done, but by the absence of special protection that others enjoyed. Imagine realizing that you were going to die not because you were guilty, but because you were expendable. The psychological cruelty of this situation extends beyond just the victims to their families, their friends, their children who would grow up knowing that their fathers had been sacrificed to appease the demands of people their grandfather had wronged. The ripple effects of trauma, loss, and survivor guilt would echo through generations, creating new cycles of pain and potentially new desires for revenge. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire execution was its timing and location. The Gibeonites specifically chose the beginning of barley harvest, the season when life should be bursting forth from the earth to stage their public display of death. They selected Gibeah, Saul's hometown, the very place where he had first been crowned king, to hang the bodies of his descendants. Every detail was calculated for maximum psychological impact. designed to ensure that the lesson would be burned into Israel's collective memory for generations to come. The hanging itself was the most shameful form of execution available under ancient law, reserved for the worst criminals and designed to serve as a public warning about the consequences of serious crimes. By demanding this particular method of death, the Gibeonites were making a statement that went far beyond simple justice. They were declaring that Saul's massacre of their people was not just murder, but the most heinous form of betrayal possible, worthy of the most degrading punishment available. The public nature of the execution was equally important to their purposes. These 7 men didn't die quietly in some private ceremony. They died on a hilltop where everyone could see them, where travelers would pass by and witness the consequences of crossing the Gibeonites, where the entire nation would be forced to confront the reality that even the royal family was subject to their power when justice was on their side. And then came the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire story. As those 7 bodies hung lifeless in the spring sunshine, as the nation tried to move on from the unpleasant necessity of what had been done, as political attention shifted to other matters and normal life resumed its rhythm, one person refused to let the tragedy fade into comfortable memory. Rizpah's decision to maintain her vigil beside those corpses was more than just maternal grief. It was a prophetic act that challenged the entire framework within which Israel understood justice, mercy, and the cost of keeping promises. By sitting day and night beside the bodies of her dead sons and the 5 other young men, she was asking questions that no one else wanted to face. Yes, divine justice had been satisfied. Yes, the blood guilt had been removed. Yes, the famine was ending and the land was healing. But what about the human cost? What about the mothers who would weep for the rest of their lives? What about the children who would grow up without fathers? What about the wives who would sleep alone in beds that would never again know the warmth of their husband's presence? Her vigil forced everyone who encountered it to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that justice, even necessary justice, always comes at a price that extends far beyond legal requirements. Every person who passed by that hillside and saw this woman keeping her lonely watch was confronted with the truth that behind every divine judgment, every political solution, every necessary sacrifice, there are real relationships, real losses, real people bearing consequences they never chose. The physical demands of what she was doing were almost beyond human endurance. The Palestinian climate during spring and summer is brutal, with scorching heat that can kill during the day and cold that cuts to the bone at night. She had no shelter except the sackcloth she had spread on a rock. She had no protection except her own presence. She had no weapon against the vultures and wild animals except her fierce determination to preserve her son's dignity even in death. But the emotional and psychological toll was even more devastating. Imagine the sensory assault of living surrounded by decomposing bodies for months. The smell that would have penetrated her clothing, her hair, her very skin. The visual trauma of watching the bodies of her beloved sons slowly decay while she was powerless to prevent it. The crushing loneliness of being the only person in the world who still cared enough to stay. Yet she endured it all because love doesn't calculate the cost when something precious is at stake. Her vigil wasn't driven by hope that her actions would change anything. It wasn't motivated by belief that her sons could somehow be brought back to life. It was driven by the fierce, protective instinct of a mother who refused to let her children be forgotten, dishonored, or reduced to mere footnotes in someone else's story of justice. Every vulture she drove away was a victory for the principle that human worth transcends even death. Every wild animal she frightened off was a declaration that love doesn't end when life does. Every night she spent shivering beside those corpses was a testament to the truth that some bonds are stronger than fear, stronger than comfort, stronger than the very survival instinct itself. The months passed slowly, marked by the gradual changes in the bodies she protected. and the slow cycle of seasons that brought different challenges to her vigil. Spring gave way to summer. Summer moved toward fall, and still she maintained her watch. The initial shock of the execution faded from public memory. Political attention moved on to other crises, and life in Israel returned to its normal rhythms. But Rizpah remained. Through the blazing heat of days, when the sun seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. Through the long darkness of nights, when every sound could signal the approach of predators. Through rainstorms that turned the hillside into mud, and windstorms that filled the air with stinging sand. Through the crushing isolation of being the only person who still remembered that these 7 lives had mattered to someone. When word of her extraordinary vigil finally reached King David, it struck him like a thunderbolt of conviction. Here was a woman demonstrating the kind of persistent, sacrificial love that he himself had always tried to embody. Yet her vigil was a direct result of his own decision to hand over her sons for execution. Her faithfulness highlighted his own inner conflict. Her love magnified his own sense of responsibility. Her sacrifice reminded him that even necessary judgments come at a human cost that extends far beyond political calculations. David's response revealed the depth of his character and his understanding that true leadership involves more than just managing crises and making hard decisions. He recognized that Rizpah's vigil was a call to something higher, a reminder that even when justice has been satisfied, mercy can still find expression, that even when legal requirements have been met, human dignity still demands recognition. The proper burial he arranged wasn't just about ending Rizpah's heartbreaking vigil. It was about acknowledging that justice without compassion is incomplete, that healing without recognition of cost is hollow, that moving forward without honoring those left behind impoverishes the soul of a nation. His decision to gather not just the bones of the 7 executed men, but also the long-neglected remains of Saul and Jonathan, reveals his understanding that true restoration requires addressing old wounds as well as new ones. By burying all these remains together in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, David, was making a profound statement about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of honor even in death. The immediate result was divine approval. God heard prayer for the land, the rains came, and the cycle of judgment was finally complete. But the deeper significance lay in what had been learned about the relationship between justice and mercy, between divine law and human compassion, between necessary decisions and ongoing responsibility for those affected by those decisions. This story forces us to grapple with questions that reach into the deepest challenges of moral reasoning and spiritual maturity. When does mercy become foolishness? How do we balance compassion with obedience when they seem to conflict? What do we do when the right choice still feels wrong to our hearts? Why does God sometimes allow the most heartbreaking solutions to be the necessary ones? The answers aren't simple, but they're essential for anyone who wants to understand how God works in a broken world where perfect solutions are rarely available. Sometimes love requires us to make choices that break our hearts. Sometimes faithfulness demands actions that seem to contradict our understanding of grace. Sometimes the most merciful thing we can do in the long term requires accepting tragic consequences in the short term. But the story also reveals that God's heart is always inclined toward restoration, even within the framework of judgment. The proper burial of those 7 men wasn't required by law or demanded by justice. It was an act of pure grace, a demonstration that even when harsh measures are necessary, dignity can still be preserved, love can still be honored, and mercy can still find expression. This gives us hope for our own failures and the failures of those we love. Yes, sin has consequences that must be faced. Yes, some choices create damage that can't be easily undone. Yes, sometimes innocent people suffer for others' mistakes. But God's ultimate purpose is always redemption, always healing, always the restoration of what has been broken by human failure. The legacy of this shocking story continues to challenge and inspire people thousands of years after it was first recorded. It reminds us that our choices have consequences that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances, that the promises we make create obligations that may outlast our own lives, that the compromises we accept to solve immediate problems may create far greater problems for future generations. It warns us about the danger of trusting our own wisdom when God's guidance is available, about the seductive appeal of solutions that seem reasonable but violate divine principles, about the way spiritual compromise creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit generations later. But it also shows us that even in the darkest moments of judgment and loss, love finds a way to express itself. Mercy discovers opportunities to manifest, and hope emerges from situations that seem hopeless. Rizpah's vigil stands as an eternal testimony to the power of love to transform even the most tragic circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. The image of a mother sitting beside the bodies of her dead sons, fighting off scavengers day and night for months, should disturb us. It should make us uncomfortable with easy answers about justice and mercy. It should force us to grapple with the reality that in a fallen world, even necessary judgments come at a human cost that extends far beyond legal requirements. But it should also inspire us with the knowledge that love like Rizpah's exists, that such dedication is possible, that human beings are capable of transcending their own comfort and safety to protect what matters most to them. Her story reminds us that even when we can't change outcomes, we can still choose how we respond to them. As we reach the climax of this ancient drama, we're confronted with truths that echo through every generation and challenge every assumption we have about fairness, justice, and the cost of our choices. The ritual of the Gibeonites wasn't just shocking because of its brutality. It was shocking because it revealed the terrifying precision with which consequences follow choices, the inevitable way that compromise creates vulnerability, and the heartbreaking reality that sometimes the innocent must pay for the guilty. Yet even in this darkness, light breaks through. Even in this judgment, mercy finds expression. Even in this tragedy, love proves stronger than death itself. Because the God who demanded justice for the Gibeonites is also the God who honored Rizpah's vigil and moved David's heart toward compassion. He is the God who works through both law and grace, both judgment and compassion, both consequences and forgiveness, to accomplish purposes that serve both His holiness and His love. The shocking ritual of the Gibeonites teaches us that in God's economy, nothing is wasted, no love is forgotten, and no sacrifice is meaningless. Even the darkest chapters of judgment can become the foundation for the brightest expressions of mercy. Even the most tragic consequences can become the seedbed for the most beautiful demonstrations of grace. But here's what makes this story absolutely essential for us today. We're living in a generation that faces the same temptations that destroyed Israel. We're constantly pressured to make decisions based on what seems reasonable rather than what God has clearly commanded. We're told that mercy means never saying no, that love means never drawing hard lines, that wisdom means finding middle ground between obedience and compromise. The Gibeonites are still among us, still approaching with their moldy bread and torn wineskins, still presenting compelling cases for why God's standards are too harsh, why His commands are too extreme, why reasonable people should find more sophisticated solutions. They come wearing the language of compassion, draped in the vocabulary of mercy, appealing to our pride in being enlightened and tolerant. And just like Israel's leaders, we're tempted to trust what we can see rather than seek what God has spoken. We want to believe that our good intentions can override divine instructions, that our understanding of love is more complete than God's revelation of truth, that our desire to be merciful justifies our refusal to be obedient. But this story screams a warning across the centuries. Every compromise you make today creates a precedent for tomorrow. Every time you choose human wisdom over divine guidance, you strengthen the neural pathways that make that choice feel natural and right. Every shortcut you take around God's clear commands becomes a highway for future destruction to travel straight into your life. The price of compromise isn't always immediate. The Gibeonites served faithfully for generations before their true nature was revealed. The consequences of Israel's hasty decision didn't manifest until centuries later. But when the bill came due, it was paid in blood. What compromises are you tolerating in your life right now? What relationships are you maintaining despite knowing they pull you away from God's best? What habits are you justifying because they're not obviously destructive? What attitudes are you accepting because confronting them would be uncomfortable? These aren't just personal lifestyle choices, they're spiritual decisions that will shape not only your future, but the future of everyone connected to your life. Your children will inherit the spiritual DNA you create through your choices. Your grandchildren will live in the world shaped by the precedents you establish. The compromises you make today may become the weapons that destroy the next generation, but there's hope in this story that goes deeper than its warnings. Because even when we've made terrible choices, even when our good intentions have created devastating consequences, even when innocent people are suffering for sins they didn't commit, God's heart is still inclined toward restoration. David couldn't undo his decision to hand over those 7 men. He couldn't bring them back to life or erase the trauma their families had endured. But he could still choose mercy within the framework of justice. He could still honor dignity even after judgment had been executed. He could still demonstrate that love finds a way to express itself even in the darkest circumstances. Rizpah's vigil reminds us that when we can't change outcomes, we can still choose how we respond to them. When we can't prevent tragedy, we can still determine whether that tragedy will be meaningless or meaningful. When we can't save those we love from consequences, we can still sit with them in their suffering and refuse to let them face it alone. The proper burial of those 7 men teaches us that healing requires more than just satisfying legal requirements. True restoration involves acknowledging cost, honoring sacrifice, and ensuring that even those who have fallen under judgment are remembered with dignity. So what does this mean for you right now in this moment as you face your own impossible choices and navigate your own moral complexities? It means that seeking God's guidance isn't optional when the stakes are high. It means that good intentions without divine direction can lead to devastating consequences. It means that the mercy you show without wisdom can become the instrument of future destruction. But it also means that even when you've made terrible mistakes, even when you're living with consequences you never intended to create, even when you're forced to make choices that break your heart, God's purposes are still being accomplished. His love is still available. His mercy is still accessible. His restoration is still possible. The story of the Gibeonites is ultimately about the complex, sometimes painful process through which both justice and mercy work together to heal what has been broken and restore what has been lost. It's about a God who demands holiness but provides grace, who executes judgment but offers forgiveness, who allows consequences but works redemption. And in that process, even the most shocking rituals, the most disturbing judgments, and the most heartbreaking sacrifices can become part of a larger story of redemption that extends far beyond our ability to understand or control. The question is, will you seek His guidance before making the decisions that will shape your future? Will you choose obedience even when compromise seems more reasonable? Will you trust His wisdom even when you can't understand His ways? Because the God who worked through Cyrus to free His people, who used Esther to save them from destruction, who honored Rizpah's vigil and moved David's heart toward mercy, is the same God who wants to work through your life today. But He can't guide decisions you never ask Him about. He can't prevent consequences you create by ignoring His voice. He can't protect you from compromises you choose despite His warnings. The ritual of the Gibeonites stands as an eternal reminder that our choices matter more than we realize, that our compromises cost more than we imagine, and that our decisions echo through generations in ways we never anticipate. But it also stands as a testament to the truth that even in our failures, even in our darkest moments, even when we're forced to live with consequences we never intended to create, God's love finds a way to transform tragedy into triumph, judgment into mercy, and death into life. The choice is yours. The moment is now. The God who spoke to Joshua, who guided David, who honored Rizpah's love, is speaking to you. Will you listen?